Squirrel! Let's start. Here we go. We're talking about Southwest Native Americans. Let's shoot the breeze together. Let's kind of review some of the Western Native Americans that lived in North America for a long period of time, long before Christopher Columbus decided to sail the ocean blue in 1492 and say that he discovered North America, which he didn't. But Native Americans were here long before he was here, and so they were experts at minding their own business and mining the land. And so they knew how to use their environment to meet their needs for food, clothing, and shelter. Let's begin. Natural resources: animals, rivers, land, trees, rocks, and plants. You've seen these before. We see them all around us, but they use them well, and I'm going to talk about how they use them right now. Clothing. If you're a Hopi man, you didn't wear much clothes because it's so hot. And really, they just didn't see a need to wear much clothing. They didn't wear business suits back then because, well, it's 100 degrees in some areas in the spring and summertime. So men didn't wear much clothing. If they did, they wore something called a loincloth, which if you think about Tarzan, it's something that covers your front side and your back side. And I'll leave it at that. Okay, now, men would wear breechcloths at times. It's kind of like pants, kind of, sort of. It's kind of like chaps. It's kind of like something you'd wear if you're like riding a bull, if you're at a rodeo. And so it's something to protect your legs, your knees, your shins. But they would wear those seasonally when it was appropriate. Short kilts. Yes, a kilt is a small dress. And so men would sometimes wear a kilt. Hopi women wore knee-length cotton dresses called mantas. And so the women wore dresses, but like I said, depending on the climate, depending on what time of the season, that's what you would see them wearing. Shelter, okay? They have a very unique shelter, and what's interesting about Southwestern Native Americans, the Anasazi, or the cliff dwellers, cave dwellers, they actually use their environment to make these elaborate apartment-like buildings made out of clay, straw, and we're going to talk about that right now. They began being built in the 11th century. They're known as adobe houses or pueblos. Can you say pueblo? Pueblo. They're still lived in today by some Southwestern Native Americans. They've been renovated, of course, and modernized, but if you go to the Southwest, one thing that you'll find interesting is that if you look at the houses, they all look the same color, or the shade of color. And the reason why, because they have used their environment, and they don't, like, you wouldn't see like a neon yellow house or a pink house or a blue house or even a white house. They're all different kind of shades of red and brown, which if you look at the climate or if you look at the environment around you, well, the soil's that color, so they use their environment even today. Made of clay, mud, grass, straw, and sand. Usually red, off-white, kind of like a yellowish white, tan, or brown in color. The location of Southwestern Native Americans, they lived in the Southwest. They lived in Utah, they lived in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and in Texas. T for Texas. Climate. Well, it was hot, boys and girls. It was very hot in the Southwest, and so the precipitation varied. They wouldn't get a lot of it, so they had to become experts at irrigating their crops and using the creeks and rivers and streams that they had and divert them so they could irrigate or water their crops. All right, they had cool nights, less than 10 centimeters of precipitation annually. So if you look up at the Pacific Northwest, where they got over 120 centimeters, and then you had a little bit less than that in the Plateau region, you had only 10 centimeters of precipitation annually, 10 centimeters, about that much of rain all year long. And so you're thinking to yourself, whoa, dude, like, how did they get the drinking water? Like, so what you do is you collect it. They would have storage. They would make storage containers, and they would try to collect fresh water. And like I said, they would know the land so well. They knew where streams were. They knew where they could get their source of water if they needed it. Tribes. I've actually been through the American Southwest, and they have a very unique and interesting culture, but they're very proud of it. I've actually had the opportunity to talk to Zuni Native Americans who were very proud of their culture and kind of gave me the 411 or information about their culture. The Zuni, the Hopi, the Yuman, the Navajo, the Apache, the Pueblo, and the Pima. These are all Native Americans that were in northwestern Mexico, southwestern United States. And the climate in those areas were just so extremely high, but they adapted, just like animals do, they adapted to meet their needs so they could survive. Culture, they had Kachina dolls. Yeah, not Barbie dolls, but Kachina dolls. And that was just a reflection of who they were. And so you would see children playing with Kachina dolls. You had medicine men. We didn't have doctors back then. You didn't have Dr. Quinn, medicine woman. No, what you had was you had medicine men that they knew their environment so well that what they could do, they could find the perfect herb or perfect plant or the perfect remedy to help you get better if that's what you needed. They had dancing, singing, songs, ceremonies, religion, prayer, and storytelling. Native Americans were expert storytellers, and the reason why I say that is because that is a tradition, oral tradition. They would tell a story, or they would have a story about how they came to arrive in the Southwest. They would share that story with their children, and then their children would share it with their children, and their children with their children. And it would change slightly over the course of time, but the same elements were still there in their stories, so they were expert storytellers. That's just part of their culture. Transportation, walking. No cars. They walked. No water, no oceans, not large rivers that they had. No, they walked. That's how they got from point A to point B. Physical features. They had mesas, which are large flat tops. They were in the desert. They had the Grand Canyon to look at, so they didn't have to travel far to see some great sightseeing. Hot and arid land. The land was tough. It had a lot of clay in it, and so it retained water, but at deeper levels within the soil. Very little rain, so they had to make use of the precipitation that they got. And then they had the Rio Grande, which is now a natural border between the United States and Mexico. They were hunters, but they couldn't rely on it because the animals and the game that were in that particular area, they couldn't meet all of their needs for food, clothing, and shelter based on hunting alone. So, but when they did hunt, they hunted for rabbit, jackrabbit, with the big old ears, quail type of bird. Then they had deer, sheep, and goats. And so when they would climb up in elevation, they would see the sheep and goats, and they would domesticate these animals, such as sheep and goats, many thousands of years after their arrival. Farming. Well, they were expert farmers. If you know anything about Southwestern Native Americans, they knew how to use the land to their advantage. They planted corn. They actually were the responsible party of how corn ended up on the eastern coast of the United States and were traded with the Europeans that would eventually come after the development and the colonization of Jamestown by the British. Squash and melons, beans, wild potato, pinyon, wheat, onions, peaches, chilies, and sunflower. They actually they grew the sunflower to assist with the pollination of their many other crops, but what they did, they would harvest the seeds after the sunflowers were finished growing, and then they would eat the seeds, save the seeds. They would actually use the seeds to bring the quail and other birds, and they would hunt them, throw rocks, they would use slingshots, but like I said, they were very crafty, very creative, and still are today. Now, gathering. When they could not meet their needs with hunting and farming, they could gather. They knew their land so well that they knew exactly what they were looking for. So they knew which plants were good for them, which ones were not. And so pine nuts come from pine trees, and pine nuts were actually a type of nut that they would use to add to their protein that they needed. Prickly pear, yucca, which is like a bulb, berries, currants, nuts, seeds, and then they even had salt. They harvested salt because if you know anything about the Southwest used to be underneath water, and there's great salt flats within the area as well. So they would harvest salt, and they could actually cure some of the meat that they would get from hunting, and they could preserve it for a time that they would need it. Bada bing, bada boom, wrapped up with this. I'll see you later. How you doing?